Oh, this is the only thing I've got in terms of a sports-related story for today's show. So Jalen Rose expressed disappointment in the inclusion of Kevin Love to Team USA's men's basketball team later on in the summer in Tokyo. He called it a white tokenism pick. But one of the points he tried to argue in the video is that uh, the United States is afraid of sending an all black team to the Olympics. And while I agree with the idea in feeling, the facts are just not true in this instance. Ever since 1996, the next Olympics teams, 2000, 04, 08, 2012, 2016. Guess how many of those teams featured a white player on the roster? Yes, that's right. For the last five Olympic teams have featured an all black roster. And even though emotionally I do sympathize with the argument, it is just a factually wrong argument. But I will give him this. Where his argument holds more weight is during the off years of the Olympics, like the World Basketball Championship and the World Cup, because those off years are the ones where the white player who you question whether they deserve to be part of the team does make the roster. I mean, Mason Plumlee, he's been on multiple off-year Team USA basketball rosters as well. That's one of the recent examples in addition to Kevin Love. And that often that white inclusion happens more during the Olympic off years. So his point is more valid in that aspect, but when it comes time to the actual Olympics, that trend isn't true. And back in the late 80s and early 90s, the white American was more of a forced inclusion into the Team USA basketball team, with Christian Laettner being thrown into the Dream Team. But then again, you still had a bit more talented white American players back in the 90s as opposed to now, where the majority of your good white players are international. Then, also John Stockton, Chris Mullin, Rex Chapman, Dan Marley. Even though not all these guys played on Olympic teams, there are a lot more uh, white American players who are starter type talents. And right now, the NBA doesn't have as many of those white starter type talents. But I do understand why Kevin Love feels like a forced inclusion into this Team USA roster. And I felt like that was more of a legacy pick as a guy who was on the 2012 roster. And I felt like that was more of a nostalgia pick rather than a tokenism pick. So I think that's another instance where Jalen Rose is off on this. And last night, I even discussed the Team USA basketball roster. And I felt like there are other guys who could have been on the roster in his place, such as I felt like if Miles Turner was healthy, he would probably be the pick over Kevin Love. And Jalen Rose threw out DeAndre Ayton. But the thing is, Ayton may still want to continue to play for the Bahamas national team, so that may not even be a realistic option as either. But even when you look at some of the other options that could have been in play for Team USA, for other bigs, they just, once you get into true bigs, the options become a lot more limited. And on the merits of his play, I don't feel like Kevin Love is valid enough to be on this team outside of just a nostalgia. And I think one of the big goals of this roster was to try to bring a lot of those nostalgia type picks in place when Kevin Durant agreed to join. They nearly had James Harden and Chris Paul on board, and that would have added to it. But I think that was part of the idea of the construction of this roster. I emotionally sympathize to the argument of Jalen Rose, but he's off base in how he applies it. This forced inclusion of white players happens much more during the off-Olympic years, and that's where his point holds more validity. But 4 of the past 6 Olympic teams, once you include this year's, haven't included a white player. And that's just where he's factually not true on.